Hello, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. And thank you for being with us today. We're excited to get started. Just going to go over a few housekeeping items while we have people joining us this morning. So first of all, we always like to keep our webinars very conversational. As usual, we welcome your questions throughout today's webinar. It's very easy to send us questions. If you go to the bottom of your Zoom control panel, you can click on the Q&A button and submit questions that way. Feel free to also post questions throughout in the chat, and we'll make sure we get to as many as we can live. If we don't have time to answer your question, we will be sure to follow up with you afterwards. You can also follow today's discussion on Twitter. We'll be live tweeting throughout the webinar at Rio_SEO, and we always use the hashtag RioWebinar. We're also using the hashtag GBP Insights 2022 for the study that we'll be discussing today. And finally, we will send a link to this webinar recording within the next 24 hours. So please look for a follow-up email from our team with more details, as well as the link to the full study. So jumping in, my name is Justin Gianninoto. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing here at Rio SEO. I'll be moderating today's discussion. And if any of you are wondering, I am not Mick Wilson. So if you tuned in for Mick Wilson, I know he has a big fan following. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here with us today. But Mick, if you're listening, I'm going to do the best I can to fill in your shoes. So excited to be with you today, Ryan and Marshall. We have a fantastic panel. Ryan Weber is our Director of Client Success here at Rio SEO. And Marshall Nyman is an Account Director here at Rio SEO. Each of you want to just take a moment to briefly introduce yourself and give a little bit of background on your experience in local. So maybe Ryan, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Justin. Yeah, I'm based in Los Angeles. I've been in the digital marketing and SEO space for about 15 years now. And almost half of that time I've actually spent at Rio, working on the client success team here, where we advise clients on all things local search, kind of part of what we're doing today. So excited to be with you guys.
Hey guys, I'm also based in Los Angeles. I've been in the digital marketing space for just over a decade, focused on local marketing for the last 5 years. Been with Rio now 3.5 years, and also a silver product expert for Google Business Profiles.
Thank you both. Excited to have you here with us. And let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to do is actually poll you all. So I'm going to launch that poll right now. We love your feedback to get more insight into how your marketing metrics have shifted over the past 2 years as compared to before COVID. So we have 5 answers to choose from. You should be seeing that poll on your screen now. If you can go ahead and submit your responses, that'd be fantastic. So how have your local marketing metrics shifted over the past 2 years? They were largely down, but making a comeback, largely down and continue to remain down, largely up and continue to improve, largely up, but are starting to drop again in 2022, or you've seen no change in your metrics, which I would expect very few businesses have seen no changes in their metrics, but let's see what we get back. I'll give you guys just another minute or two to fill out this poll. Looks like we're getting some responses coming in. I'll just give another 10 or 15 seconds.
Yeah, if anybody has answer E, I'd like to hear more about that one.
All right, let's see where we are. So I'll go ahead and share these results with everyone. It looks like with 43%, they were largely up and continue to improve in 2022. Which is fantastic. Obviously, depending on the verticals, and we're going to go through a bunch of different verticals today, but I'm sure there are different circumstances. Great to see that some of the metrics have continued to improve going into 2022. And then the second option, they were largely up but are starting to drop in 2022. So a little bit of the flip side there. It's around 30% of the audience. So I think we're gonna hit on some of those things depending on which vertical you're in and the results that we've seen with some of our clients. So looking forward to diving into that, and thank you all for sharing your feedback there. So we released this study earlier this morning. We'll give you guys the link to the full study at the end of the webinar and also be sharing that via email, but we're going to go through some of the key findings this morning. So obviously, any consumer behavior data, there are going to be shifts, and especially during the past 2 years, given economic changes, what's happening in the current environment, or other unforeseen disruptions. the shifts, marketers and businesses have seen over the past 2 years are just another reminder that your local strategy should be designed to continually evolve and adapt. And keeping a pulse on, the performance of your peers in your vertical, as well as what's happening in some of the other verticals, is a great way to recognize some of these ongoing trends that we're going to talk through today and just benchmark your success as a business. So this study is the second year that we've released this study. We looked at over 170,000 US business locations across the past 2 years, January 2020 through December 2021. And we looked at 8 different verticals. So that includes service businesses, financial services, sit-down restaurants, quick service restaurants, hotels, retail, healthcare, and multifamily residential. And all of these metrics were pulled from Google Business Profile Insights. We're going to be talking about local organic search volume, as well as local search views, and then conversion actions, such as clicks, phone calls, and driving directions. So going into some of the data and the findings, and you'll see here some of the highlights over the past year or so, where there were some changes in the business environment and things that were happening in the US related to COVID that had an impact on some of these metrics. So in particular, in 2021, vaccines were rolled out. So as more consumers had access to vaccines, we started to see, a pretty big uptick and lift in search views, total searches, total clicks, particularly around March. And then another, lift around October of 2021, right before the Omicron variant became really widespread. So these metrics definitely aligned very closely with what we saw in terms of COVID cases last year. Anything that you guys noticed that you'd like to add here or highlight?
No, I mean, I think the key point, right, is you can't talk about local search performance. You can't talk about, the economy. You can't talk about any of that over the last 2 years without talking about COVID. So I think it's no surprise, right, that these trends align very closely with, the different, vaccinations becoming widely available, restrictions easing, and then spikes later on in things like Omicron and Delta. So makes sense. And that'll be a theme throughout as we go through each vertical.
Absolutely. And similarly, when we looked at conversion actions, they fluctuated quite a bit as, different travel restrictions and business restrictions, depending on, your local state or municipality, changed throughout the year and adapted to what was happening in the COVID environment. We found that ensuring locations were flexible enough to, handle these different influxes and outflows, depending on what was happening in the environment, does help and does have an impact on ensuring that your business is responsive enough to be able to handle those types of shifts. So looking at this a little more closely, particularly driving directions really plummeted at the end of May and June. We saw a big uptick in consumers opting for delivery as their primary method of shopping across different verticals. And this did ultimately rebound and even somewhat overcorrected as consumers found new sources. As business interruptions continued, the consumers found different ways to shop, and this definitely continued to have an impact as well on driving directions and consumers looking to visit local businesses. Although toward the end of the year, before the Omicron variant, we definitely, as I said earlier, saw a little bit of an uptick heading into the holiday shopping season last year.
Yeah. I think pre-pandemic, website visits were like a very small part of the puzzle. And then soon as the pandemic hit, we saw driving directions, which we always looked at the main indicator for are people coming into your locations. Now, people aren't coming into locations. People are now ordering online, picking up, having a different means of acquiring whatever it's the product or service that they were getting. So now we're seeing that website visits are just a much larger part of the puzzle, and people are now trying to figure out how I can continue to grow that. I think a lot of businesses didn't see it as as important piece as it is now. And so I think driving directions are pretty much back to where we were pre-pandemic for at least a lot of the brands that I've seen, and website visits are still up and then higher than they were before the pandemic. So I think that's one of the interesting things with conversions and how it's been affected by the pandemic.
Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
another area, right, that the pandemic had a big impact, and actually Google encouraged this as well. But the huge increase we saw in clicks to call, right? I think it's similar to your point, Marshall, that folks were looking for more information, right, or wanting to confirm, fulfillment methods and availability. There was actually a period where Google added effectively a call to action. There was a note on each business listing saying, call this business to confirm their operating hours or to confirm that they're open. And so you see that very clearly, this massive spike when that messaging went out. And then a lot of brands now are dealing with, when we do year-on-year numbers each month, we see these year-on-year decreases in call volume. And it's kind of a, the sort of lagging indicator of that spike that we saw when Google had that messaging out and when people were really sort of uncertain and looking for more information.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive in a little bit deeper and start talking about specifically what we found when looking at some of these verticals. So, starting off with service businesses, when mask restrictions eased toward the end of the summer in 2021, we definitely saw some increases around the summer prior to Omicron, and service businesses overall had a pretty nice recovery in terms of searches and listing views. And as you'll see in both this chart and the chart that shows conversion actions on the next slide, we definitely had a pretty steady increase in both metrics starting in April 2020, and then continuing that trend upward all throughout 2021.
Yeah, a lot of volatility.
Yeah.
I think in the past it usually was just like a slow line continuing upwards to the right corner. Now it's like basically whatever trends there are with COVID, also a lot of weather related stuff. There's so many things that are going on today in this environment that it seems like there's just a lot of fluctuations which we didn't see in the past.
Yeah, and service. So this service businesses vertical, this is one of the most sort of broad ranging, right? Different types of businesses. But I think one of the big drivers for that early volatility, anything that's like personal care, right? So think barbershops, salons, gyms, right? Those kind of things that were truly shut down and not operating. You see that massive dip, and then there's just this pent up demand, right? People needed haircuts, so as soon as you could go in and do that, there was sort of this flood of demand that came as soon as those restrictions started to lift. And it's just great to see through the back half of 2021 that the recovery really has continued for these businesses.
Yeah, and you see most of the demand in the beginning was for phone calls and websites. So it did take a while too before directions even started to kind of come back to where it was. But over time now it is trending higher than it was. And I think that also speaks to the pent up demand is people have been waiting for a haircut and now it's, just through the roof on where it was in the past as far as directions.
I think that's a great point. I mean, this is definitely one of the most unique verticals we're going to talk about because it does encompass so many different types of businesses, but it's also one of those verticals to your point, Ryan, that you can't really replace it so much with a website visit. It's something that is a little bit unique in that we saw some of that traffic really more so coinciding with some of the restrictions that were in place.
Yeah, and I think that's why you see websites are starting to level off to where it was pre-pandemic, where a lot of maybe businesses that are doing pickup delivery, you're seeing that website visit metrics still stay on the rise.
Absolutely. All right. So I think we covered service businesses pretty well. If anyone has any questions, feel free to throw those into the Q&A and we'll address those toward the end. But moving along to financial services. So definitely a little bit more volatility than you saw with service businesses, mainly, until kind of late summer 2020. Obviously, there were a lot of changes in terms of, business investment, in terms of dollars that were going to these businesses from government programs, businesses being open and closed. So really in August of 2020, we see a bigger uptick in searches and views, and kind of remain relatively steady throughout 2021, more so than 2020. But there was definitely a larger impact that you're seeing here from more direct economic impact than we probably saw in other verticals.
Yeah, I think when we talked about this a year ago on the webinar, the stimulus was one of the main factors for the different spikes, and you can actually see they're kind of consistent um, with the time periods in between them. So it likely aligns with when people were getting those stimulus checks, and then you can see at the end of the year they kind of stopped, and then I'm assuming we see the bump in the end of the year for the holidays, people getting bonuses or gifts or any of that nature. So I think it's in line with more of the economic activity that we're seeing, which is due to the pandemic, but a lot of volatility, but almost consistent in those periods.
Yeah, I think the other sort of behavior that's included here is mortgage. The mortgage vertical, right, is contained, right, and so obviously the last 2 years, one of the sort of consistent themes has been this red hot housing market, right? And people, whether they're refinancing or looking to purchase, that demand, has been strong. And then you see, sort of as rates started to rise toward the end of last year, demand, maybe tapering a little bit if we look at those phone calls or clicks to the website, where it was, stronger earlier in the pandemic. Sort of the flip side of the stimulus point.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we'll as we're going to get into restaurants and hospitality next, we'll start to see some of the impacts, I think, of the stimulus as well on some of these other verticals where it might have impacted spending and how consumers were shopping. So definitely a lot of correlations between these verticals as well. So moving into the restaurant vertical. So we'll start with sit down, and then we broke out quick service restaurants separately as well. This restaurant businesses obviously were one of, if not the most, largely impacted vertical throughout the pandemic, with the openings and the closures. A really challenging period over the past 2 years for restaurant brands. But restaurants have started to see a pretty significant comeback, and by March of last year in 2021, March, April, views were up almost over 240% from the data that we analyzed. Searches were up over 300%. So definitely some pretty significant bounce back period in the restaurant vertical. Anything that you guys saw specifically with sit down restaurants?
Yeah, I think there's actually more volatility here than probably in any of the other slides that we've already looked at. It's not as like the spikes aren't as large as some of the other ones, but you see pretty much on a month-to-month basis, it's up and it's down. I think as far as the restaurant category goes in general, there's so many factors from the pandemic that have affected restaurants: supply chain, employment, inflation, the price of food. There's so many things that with the industry that have changed. Also, a lot of businesses were not focused on online ordering or delivery, and now it's something that they are offering, or it's something that they see as a big part of their business going forward. So there's just been so many changes with the businesses, and they've had to adapt to all of the regulations in every different district. So depending on where you are, even in like the same states, some counties have different rules. So like it's just a lot for businesses that are in the restaurant side to kind of figure out. So I think that's just why you've seen so much volatility. Some restaurants have had to close some nights because food or staffing shortages, and it's all related to the pandemic, but it's just driven a lot of volatility. What I am seeing overall though is restaurants are starting to trend back where they were ahead of the pre-pandemic point. So it looks like driving directions is basically back to that point, and then online ordering has just become a bigger part of the business, and so that's trending upwards. So I think it's just a shift in how these businesses are being run, and there's just a lot of factors here.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect summary, Marshall. And I think, one of the things, especially early in the pandemic, the brands that were winning in this sit down vertical were the brands that could pivot quickly to that takeout and delivery type of operation, because they weren't all set up for it, right? Some were really dependent on, that dine-in customer, and they just weren't logistically, they weren't ready to support that. And you, as you said, with some of the supply chain challenges, it took some brands longer than others to really gear up for that. And now it's almost to a point where how do we, welcome folks back into the restaurant, but sustain as much of that takeout and delivery business that really kept us going the last couple of years, right?
Yeah, and the sit down business versus like a quick serve was definitely impacted much more heavily in the beginning because these businesses had less of a to go program, and they were pretty much focused on indoor dining, where some of the quick serve restaurants they had maybe a process to do pickup and delivery, or maybe they had outdoor seating already. So I think there's just been a little bit more of a struggle on the sit down side. And also from a staffing standpoint, it requires a lot more people to run a sit down restaurant versus some of the quick serve. So I think there was a lot more issues that they were dealing with in the beginning. That's why you see such a massive drop. I think when we look at quick serve, you'll see it wasn't as effective in the beginning because people could still visit those types of businesses. And actually, some of them did even better in the beginning of the pandemic because of the shift of what was going on, and is easier to go to a place where you can drive through and pick it up and know it'll be quick and you don't have to interact with anybody by going inside.
Absolutely. And to the point earlier about certain businesses being possibly more equipped to facilitate those changes to online ordering, to curbside pickup and those types of services, we did get a question actually around data on local sit down restaurants versus national chains. And we didn't break out chains versus more local businesses in our data because we mostly work with enterprise brands. But just anecdotally and based on what we've seen over the past year, certainly some of the larger businesses were most likely more well equipped to more quickly implement some of those changes, and having a platform in order to do so certainly makes that a lot easier. I don't know if you guys have anything additionally to add to that, but I thought that was an interesting question.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, right? That the data that we're looking at is really exclusively enterprise, right? So this is looking at the national chains. So we don't necessarily have hard data to put side by side on how kind of local mom and pop restaurants fared relative to the chains. But I think Justin, your point stands, right? That just given their leverage in the marketplace, they were in some cases maybe better equipped to make that transition. At the same time, though, you have to think, a larger organization that's making this change for hundreds or thousands of stores versus a mom and pop that's got one location. Maybe they, in some cases, could have moved more quickly. So, yeah, it's an interesting question. Maybe one that we could try to follow up on at some point to see, if we can compare that local mom and pop data to, the sort of enterprise level data that we have here.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Appreciate it. And so let's continue. I think you were making some good points, Marshall, around the comparison between sit down and quick serve. And we definitely saw some differences in the metrics here. Obviously, while some sit down restaurants with indoor dining might have been closed, quick service restaurants were able to possibly, more easily shift to a takeout, curbside pickup type of operation. And, potentially better poised to adapt to some of those pandemic struggles as things shifted. Any additional findings here that you guys wanted to highlight?
Just that clicks didn't drop off as much. So it's the purple line. So you see like searches and views dip significantly, but clicks for these types of locations didn't. So I think it'd be actually great to see the next slide too, so you can see how it broken out. But you'll see here, yeah, most businesses we were just looking at the dip for driving directions in early stage of the pandemic. I mean, it almost hit like zero. Where you're seeing here, it's a little bit of a drop, and then pretty much after a few months, it's ahead of where it was. So people were visiting these types of locations because they were prepared for this type of situation with the way their business model works. So having a drive-through or having a designated pickup area, these businesses, some of them flourish. So I think when we think about the very first part of the webinar where we asked that question is, how is your business affected from the pandemic? A lot of quick serve restaurants that I work closely with, it actually was a positive for them, even though the pandemic wasn't a great thing. It was a driver for their business, and you see there's just kind of how they were set up to be able to adapt to all of the changes.
Absolutely.
And one thing to point out too, and this applies to both sit down and quick serve, right? Any of the clicks on the integrated online ordering link in the knowledge panel, right, are not actually captured here. So this is sort of, just the core click for driving directions, click to call, and click to the website. But anyone who's starting an order directly from the knowledge panel is incremental to this. So I think, Marshall, your point, right, that we see click for driving directions still so strong. It was really just a short-term dip, and then, once again at the beginning of 21, speaks to the fact that in some cases they actually were thriving, right, in this vertical throughout the pandemic.
Yeah, and I think inflation's also going to be a factor for this going forward. Since quick serve restaurants tend to be a little bit more cost effective, I think we won't see much of a dip as some of these other businesses in the new year with Omicron. Where looking at the data, it seems like it's been at least level or continue to rise. So that's just another factor that's kind of playing in here that's helping them.
Right, for sure. Okay, I think we covered restaurants pretty well. Again, any follow-up questions on restaurants, sit down, or quick service, please feel free to throw those into Q&A. We can address those at the end. But looking at retail was another very interesting vertical with a lot of fluctuation. And I think this was a vertical that we really noted where the pandemic was something that accelerated some trends that were already, possibly happening in terms of e-commerce, buy online, pick up in store, multi-channel. Those types of options for consumers was something that businesses were already starting to implement, and this sort of forced this industry to adapt a little bit more quickly and focus on their e-commerce presence and how to drive clicks and website visits, as opposed to some of those in-store visits when they weren't able to. Listing clicks we saw were up around 35%, and clicks to website were up around 49% year over year when we looked at April 2021 data. So definitely some interesting, I think, fluctuations here as a vertical.
Yeah, the story here, like you said, Justin, is the alternative fulfillment methods, right? So whether that's buy online, pick up in store, curbside pickup, or just e-commerce, and in some cases same day delivery through things like Instacart and Shipt, or just traditional e-commerce where you're putting it in a cardboard box and having it shipped, right? The brands that were set up, really the brands that won early, were the brands that already had the logistics in place to offer a curbside pickup solution. Or same day delivery solution, right? Those brands really won. You look at, one in particular, many brands won, but I'll name one just because they had Target had the best year in their history during the pandemic, right? And so because they had this sort of the logistical capacity to do curbside pickup, to do drive up, right, to do same day delivery, they really reaped the benefits. And we saw a lot of other brands sort of as 2020 rolled on and as 2021 rolled on, started to introduce and offer competing services. But it became clear, right, consumers, it was a necessity during the pandemic, but this customer behavior shift, a large percentage of that is going to be permanent, right? People want that convenience now. They've experienced it and they expect it. And so I think that's something that's going to continue, right? That demand for curbside and same day delivery conveniences that folks have gotten used to over the last couple of years.
Yep. I can't tell you how many times I've driven up to Target, opened my trunk, put stuff in with a few minutes, and we're gone.
It's very convenient.
We went one day into the store and the product we were looking to buy was completely sold out. So I think that's the other shift is now people want, to save their time. So in knowing you're going to get something, it's already ordered, they put it in your car, you drive off, versus having to go in and maybe they don't have it. That's been a big shift too. So I think buy online as pick up in store, as you said, it's really just changed how people are shopping. And I think previously people went into the store, they wanted to touch things, feel things. Now they do a lot of their research online. They can watch a YouTube video, they can read a couple blogs. And so people have a decision on what they're going to buy before they go in the store, where I think people were more like window shopping or kind of, browsing. People now have more intent when they go into a store. So if you have that intent, you can buy it online, pick it up. It's a much easier process and it saves people time, which I think is one of the things that people really took away from the pandemic too, is they value their time more. They want to try to value, doing things quickly.
Right. Absolutely. So the effectiveness of that hybrid model, for sure. And another vertical that we saw a little bit of a hybrid shift, was in healthcare. So telehealth gave patients a new way to engage with healthcare providers, similar to in retail. How we shifted to a more virtual world. So in throughout the pandemic, you were able to get diagnosed and even sometimes prescribed treatment through telehealth. So it's something that was very interesting. Another vertical I think that was rapidly accelerated due to the pandemic, obviously faced a significant number of challenges in and of itself because of the different waves of COVID. But as far as other treatment options, that was definitely something I think that had an impact. Any additional thoughts there on healthcare?
Completely agree. I mean, that, telehealth was almost, the curbside of healthcare, right? And it's something that I think, Marshall made the point about, you know, people valuing their time more as a result of this sort of collective experience. Absolutely applies here with telehealth, right? But both for the patient and for the provider, right? They can now see more patients in a day. It makes them more efficient, more productive. It's really a win-win on both sides. And again, I think that's another trend that we're going to see sort of outlast the pandemic, as people have just gotten used to that convenience.
Yeah, it makes appointments more timely. I think everybody always hated waiting in the waiting room. And you basically, now there's two reasons. One, you don't want to sit there for an hour because people value their time. But the other thing is people are now more aware of people being sick. So, you'd always just sit in the doctor's office, and if people were coughing or not feeling well, you just didn't think much about it. I think now people are more sensitive to those types of things. So getting rid of the waiting room and being able to just wait in your own home, and when it's your turn it happens right away, so it doesn't take away from your time, is just so valuable for people. And so I don't see telehealth going away at any point. I think it's, if anything, it's just going to start to become a bigger piece of the puzzle. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out.
Absolutely. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, I think we have two more verticals to cover. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hospitality, and obviously, similar to restaurants, this was another one that was very significantly impacted throughout the pandemic by dips in tourism and people not being able to or unwilling to travel throughout the pandemic. Obviously, we're seeing signs now that is starting to rebound really strongly, and that's fantastic. But overall, I think we had a statistic around the U.S. hotel industry reporting total year-over-year revenue per available room was 83.2% of the pre-pandemic comparable. So big comeback from 2020 and before the pandemic, but obviously this was an industry that was very, very significantly impacted.
For sure. I think one thing is international travel still hasn't rebounded, but it seems like domestic travel is definitely rebounding. Conferences are starting to happen again. People are starting to get back to their normal ways traveling. So I think that probably that last 15-20%, once international travel is a little bit more open up and there's more flights and people feel more comfortable traveling, we'll probably see it get ahead of those pre-pandemic levels because there's that pent up demand. But hospitality, unlike restaurants, they were closed, completely. Yeah. Some businesses just shuttered and they were just waiting to reopen. Where some restaurants, at least they were able to have a smaller footprint. So you just see this massive drop early on, and it's just slowly coming back. I think a lot of the views that you're seeing in the previous slide were just people doing research, trying to figure out what they need to do about maybe rescheduling. And now we're seeing people actually getting back out there and going to those destinations, trips, or whatever they had planned. I definitely see it big rebound domestically, and I think slowly, hopefully, international open up, and we'll really get back to that somewhat of normalcy. I know everybody's saying that we're never going back to that whatever it's like before.
The new normal.
Yeah, the new normal, the new world. But you can see, I mean, even with Omicron, it didn't drop off that much. It's still just kind of it slowed it a little bit, but there was that huge buildup from everybody just being home for so long. And I think we'll continue to see that rise. I think this summer is likely to be a big opening once kids are out of school. I sense a lot of families want to take that vacation that they've missed out on. I know I am, at least.
Absolutely.
And I think another important point for hospitality, in addition to just the consumer behavior component, Google has made some changes as well, right? So hospitality historically was kind of, there's some features on the paid side that Google really focused on for hospitality, but there were other sort of, you had a little bit less control actually when it came to local search than we do with other verticals. And that's changing just within the last several months. So Google introduced, 100 new attributes specific to hospitality. So as a brand, you have a lot more control to, and for consumers, right, you've got a richer sort of set of filters to work with. You can be more specific in your searches. So as a hospitality brand, it's important, to make sure that you're leveraging those new attributes. And then the other thing is Google Posts, right? So practically every other vertical has access to Google Posts for, a couple of years now, and hospitality is finally just getting that access. So another, in general, it's great to see, right? Google kind of starting to give back to the hospitality vertical. And so as a hospitality brand, definitely important to make sure those attributes are, being maintained and up to date. And then of course, it's worth starting to test Google Post campaigns as well. As Marshall said, I mean, we're all, as consumers, ready, I think, for that vacation, ready to start traveling again. And, as a hospitality brand, being able to communicate offers, promotions, features, and availability directly in SERP is, an important opportunity to differentiate.
Yeah, I think it's important to communicate that because these businesses have changed a lot. So what a hospitality business offered pre-pandemic to what they offer now is definitely different. So showcasing that within the listing, making sure things are updated is definitely critical, because if you're going somewhere and it's a hotel, it's not going to be the same exact services. It's not going to be all the same restaurants. The hours are going to be different. So making sure all that data is maintained and available will help people make a decision on what location is the best for them to visit.
Absolutely. And so just wrapping up our look at some of these verticals. Last one we broke out was multifamily residential. So obviously, apartments, communities, that type of thing. And I think most people on here are probably aware that the housing market has had a significant rise the last 2 years. Multifamily was also very, very much impacted by the pandemic. There were things implemented like temporary suspensions of evictions. So the numbers of renters that paid rent dropped 12% from March into April 2020. And then in, looking at March 2020, multifamily listing views were down around 43% month over month, and searches were down around 35%. Total clicks also, looking at conversion actions, were affected, down about 25% in March. But we did see a pretty significant turnaround in the first half of 2021 as compared to the previous year, when demand started to increase again. Views went up around 173% in April of 2021. So right again around that kind of time where vaccinations were becoming more prevalent. Searches were up almost 200%, and total clicks were up about 100%. So again, another vertical with kind of its own unique story as the pandemic unfolded, but definitely some significant impacts there as well.
Yeah, I think one of the other drivers, right, is remote work. Right? I think we're all, most of the people on this call, right, are probably in that same boat where you didn't necessarily have to be in the office, or you certainly didn't have to be in the office every day. And so it led to a lot of people thinking, man, if I'm now untethered from where I've been living, where else might I want to live, right? Where can we look? And so I think you saw a lot of relocation happening over the last couple of years as we saw this sort of macro shift to remote work practices as well.
Yeah, I think there was just a large evaluation as well for everybody. They looked at their life, they looked at where they lived, they looked at their job, and with all of these major factors, people are deciding now where they want to be long term. And so you've seen a lot of shift in people moving from one state to another. Maybe they're living in more of a dense area. Now they want to be out in the suburbs. So you're just seeing like a big shift in the way people are living. And obviously, like the demand is crazy right now with the market. So we're seeing, you continued like it's not as volatile as some of the other verticals. You see it's pretty consistent in its a rise. Maybe it just with a little bit of those different surges, it slowed down here or there, but it's been pretty consistent for most of these on the upward. And I think we'll probably continue to see that, especially as mortgage rates go up. I think people will continue to be looking at the rental market. So just, pretty much almost all the metrics, I think they're up from where they were pre-pandemic.
I think also probably a lot of construction was stalled during at least the early part of the pandemic, but now a lot of those projects are most likely being finished. So hopefully, as the inventory goes up, there's more availability, lower prices, and we'll start to see more of an increase in this area too. All right, well, let's we just have a few minutes left, and we'll try to wrap this up for everyone and put a nice bow on all of our findings from this report. So overall, some of our top takeaways, as we've said throughout this webinar, we saw a big surge when we looked at April of 2021. So really right around the time when some of those mask restrictions began to ease, before the Delta variant really came into existence, and also when a lot of the vaccines were starting to roll out. Hospitality industry was one of the largest comeback stories, as we talked, pretty extensively about, as consumers, were eager to travel again. Restaurants overall, I think, as it says, still a little bit of a journey to recovery. Some of those restrictions from Omicron even were just lifted in some states like California, a month or less than 2 months ago. And there's still issues with, staff shortages, burnout, financial concerns, things along those lines that are still impacting some of those operations. So I think that's a story that's still evolving a little bit. And then healthcare, as we discussed, with the advent of a lot more telemedicine and virtual services, was another vertical that we thought was especially interesting. But any kind of parting thoughts or last takeaways that you all wanted to share with any of the brands that we have listening today that they can kind of take from these findings?
I think the most important thing is just you have to be nimble. That's what I think most brands learned over the last few years, is not sure what's going to be in the future. So having a way to be able to manage everything and be able to effectively adapt to whatever that is going to be crucial, whether it's a health issue or weather or whatever's changing in the environment that your business needs to adapt to. I think it's just being able to adapt to it as quickly as possible. The businesses that we talked about that either saw growth in the pandemic or did see a decline were ones that were able to be nimble and adapt quickly. So I think that for me is the biggest takeaway, is just you kind of have to have everything on the table for when anything happens so you can act quickly.
Yeah, 100% agree with you, Marshall. And I think, if we look at some of the specific tactics that the brands that, I don't want to say one, but the brands that are excelling are using, it's things like, we talked about these sort of transactional integrations with Google, right? If you're a restaurant, making sure that you have that online ordering integration set up. If you're a retailer, making sure you have your product and inventory data synced with GBP. Appointment booking for service verticals and healthcare, making sure you have that telehealth link, right? This sort of consumer behavior shift toward valuing ease and convenience. Google is offering tools, right, for a lot of brands to leverage to help remove some friction and lean into that convenience for customers. So I think those transactional integrations are key. And then the other thing, and we didn't really talk about it throughout this webinar, but it almost goes without saying at this point, that having some kind of customer experience program in place so that you're listening to what's being said, right? One of the big trends we could have shown, alongside all these metrics, the growth in Google reviews, right? For the same period, there's a ton of customer feedback that's come through, and the brands that, have been sort of savvy enough to listen and monitor for what the feedback is coming from customers can take that and, going back to Marshall's point about being nimble, being able to actually, ingest, analyze, and then most importantly, make operational changes in response to what your consumers are saying. I think those are the brands that are really going to continue to excel, the brands that have that kind of program in place.
I think that's a perfect point to leave you all with. And I think we could do a whole entire another webinar on reputation management and the impact of the pandemic there. But great summary. I guess we'll just leave you all with this. So we have a lot more in the full report. The link was just posted in the chat a few minutes ago. We're also going to send this out via email. We tried to cover as many of these findings as we could today, but there's a lot more within the report. So hope you all can go ahead and download that and definitely share your feedback and let us know what you think, or if there's anything else you'd like to see in this study going forward. We definitely plan to continue doing this on an annual basis and continue to monitor these trends. We also put out local search updates every single month, so please keep an eye on our blog for that. If there are any follow-up questions from the report or that we didn't get a chance to answer today, feel free to shoot us an email at marketing@rioseo.com. We'd love to talk to you about any of the findings that we've shown today. Just thank you to everybody on the line for joining, and a special thank you to Ryan and Marshall. Really appreciate your time, and thank you for both joining the panel today.
Great stuff. Thanks, Justin. Thanks, everyone.
Absolutely. We'll be sending out the recording again within the next 24 hours. So please look out for that. And again, it was a pleasure to moderate today. We hope to see you on another webinar. We do these every single month. And our next one is coming up on April 21st. So hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.